So look, I know a lot of you are struggling to create depth and distance in your paintings, but you're having trouble making those distant hills and mountains look like they're in the distance. Well, if that's you, then listen very closely, because in today's video I'm going to show you how you can create depth and distance in your landscape paintings with this really simple method. So you can transform your artworks literally with your next painting. Now I'm going to show you how to do this with this painting I created of Milford Sound in New Zealand. I'm painting on some loose Belgian linen which I've taped to a board, and the painting size roughly measures 22 centimeters by 40 centimeters. I'm also using oil paints here, and the brand of paint I'm using is Blue Ridge oils, and if you'd like to get some, I've put a link in the description box below. Now the first thing I'm doing is sketching out my composition, and I'm using burnt sienna mixed with liquid original, and the liquid original is going to help to thin the paint and speed up the drying time. Now in order to make your distant hills or mountains look like they're in the distance, we first of all need to talk about tonal values, and this is how light or dark your subject is. And the general rule is, in landscapes, that we'll find our darkest darks and our lightest lights in the foreground, but then as landforms recede, the darks aren't as dark and the lights aren't as light. So what I'm doing here, in order to begin creating depth and distance in my paintings, is I start painting the shadow areas first, as these are, for the most part, the darkest areas in the painting. So I started off with one of these distant mountains here, and I've used a mix of ultramarine blue with some burnt sienna to desaturate the colour, some titanium white and a little alizarin crimson. So we've got a mid-tone here, and then the mountain in front of it, which is called the Lion, is a bit darker, so I've used less titanium white in the mix. So if I was to use my darkest darks, which I'd find in the foreground here in the distance, there just wouldn't be any depth in it. It would mean that the mountains would come forward in the painting. So we have to think about the fact that the shadows are going to be much lighter in the distance here than they would be in the foreground. So the mountain on the left, which is called Mitre Peak, the shadow areas are a bit darker than the other mountain behind it. Now next I'm painting the clouds, and even though the clouds are often some of the more lighter values in the landscape, because there's a lot of shadows in them, I include these in my darks, and I've used the same mixture of paint that I've used for these mountains. However, I've used more titanium white. So I'm also thinking about the colour harmony in my painting, and this is where I'm going to be using common colours throughout my painting. So for example, these shadows I've used in the distant mountains, I've used the same colours in the clouds, and I'll be using a lot of these colours for my shadows as I work forward in the painting. So here, this next mountain that's on the right is getting closer, so I'm using some darker tone here. I've used a mix of ultramarine blue with some yellow ochre and a little bit of titanium white. Now because I used ultramarine blue and titanium white in the other shadow areas, including the mountains and clouds, it's got something in common with these zones, so it's going to tie it together and make the colours look more harmonious. Now for the very foreground here, I use pretty much ultramarine blue and yellow ochre, so this is where the darkest darks are going to be in the painting. So this is something to remember when you start a landscape painting. Paint your darks first, i.e. paint the shadows first, and this sets a framework for the whole painting. And then when you start to paint the areas in light, which I'm doing here, I'm painting some of the vegetation on the side of this mountain, it makes it much easier to get your colours and values correct, and the saturation of the colour, because when you start marking in your paint next to the shadows, you'll be able to easily see whether your colours are too dark or too light, or too saturated or not saturated enough. So painting the darks first really is like the skeleton of the whole painting. It just creates the framework for it and just makes it much easier to paint the areas in light afterwards. And that's what I'm doing here now. Milford Sound is one of the wettest places in New Zealand, so there's lots of greens there, lots of vegetation and trees growing on the side of the mountains, and lots of greenery along the banks of the water. This place is a natural field, so the mountains literally are coming out of the sea. So for all these greens I've created, I've been using varying mixes of yellow ochre with cadmium yellow medium, ultramarine blue and titanium white. So this is serving as the base of my greens, and then I've been adding other colours such as phthalo green and alizarin crimson. Now when I started this painting, I'm not worried about details, so I was actually using the biggest brushes I could get away with. And this is known as the blocking in stage. So really this is where we want to establish the main composition in the painting and establish those colours and tonal values as well, so we can instantly create depth and distance in the painting and we can see what it's going to look like. Then after that we let it dry and then we can start building up some details. So I was doing things like working on the clouds, and for those cloud highlights I was using titanium white with some burnt sienna mixed in, but also was allowing some of the shadow mix to mix in with it as well. So I was able to blend some of the colours on the actual canvas itself. So at this point in the painting, I'd blocked it in, it was dry, and what I was doing next was beginning to add detail and refine certain areas, which is known as modelling. So I was modelling the paint here and just starting to work on individual zones in the painting. Now, as I'd started off by painting all my dark values first, I was able to easily establish a framework in the painting that's already creating depth. But one of the other things I've done is I've kept quite a lot of my colours, especially my shadows, but also my light areas as well, just a bit tonally darker. So this is going to allow me to build up lighter layers of paint as I work through the painting, and then I'll be saving my lightest value colours until the very end of the painting, and this is what will really make it pop. Now if I was to use all my lightest lights in the beginning, then my painting could risk looking flat because I will have used up all my tonal range and I'd have nowhere else to go. So the lightest we can go is using white, so I don't want to be using pure titanium white in the early stages of the painting. If I am going to be using this, it's going to come at the end of the painting, and you'll see this in a moment. So right now I'm just building up the form of these trees and bushes here, and I'm starting to use some smaller brushes. This is a number 3 bristle flat brush, and I'm using a mix of yellow ochre with some ultramarine blue, a little bit of cadmium yellow, some titanium white, and just a little bit of alizarin crimson. Now when painting these greens, it's really important to keep in mind the saturation of the colours, and greens are definitely one of those really tricky colours. If you get your greens correct, they can look absolutely amazing in landscape painting, but if you get them wrong, they literally look horrible. So it's really important that the saturation of the green is appropriate for the area in the painting that you're creating. So for example, if your green's going to be saturated, you're probably going to be using that in the foreground. This is where we're going to find our most saturated colours. However, if you were to use a similar green that's that saturated way into the distance, then it's just not going to work. It's just going to pull it forward in the painting and you won't get any depth. The other thing is it's very easy to mix gnarly looking greens that just don't look good, and often it's just because there's too much green in it and it's too saturated. And often a way that you can tame your greens and make them look more natural is to add a colour opposite in your mix. So this could be something like a cadmium red or an alizarin crimson or a burnt sienna. These colours contain red, and red is opposite to green on the colour wheel, so it helps to desaturate the colour. So as I said, we can use our most saturated greens in the foreground, but as the greens go into the distance we need to desaturate them, and that's going to help them sit back in the landscape. Now here I was adding the reflective water in the foreground, and it's reflecting the sky and the mountains. So again, I was able to use the same colour mix as I was for those mountains and clouds. This was ultramarine blue with some burnt sienna to desaturate. And the reason this desaturates the blue is because burnt sienna is actually a dark orange, and orange is opposite to blue on the colour wheel. And then of course there's some titanium white in the mix to get the value that I want, and then there's also a little bit of alizarin crimson which helps to give it a violet tint. Now here I was starting to add more detail and to the vegetation on the side of this mountain. Now what I wanted to create in this painting was a bit of a spotlighting effect where there's some sunlight coming through the clouds and just illuminating this part of the mountain and the area here in the midground. So it's going to help to create an area of interest. One of the things about Milford Sound is it's a very iconic location in New Zealand, so it's a little bit more difficult to play around with the composition just because it's such a recognisable place. And it's why a scene like this is more suited to a longer landscape canvas here. Now what I'm doing now is I'm starting to add more detail. With my paintings in general, I like the combination of loose brushwork but a bit of detail here and there. So I'm just painting the suggestion of some of these strap-like leaves and these flax plants, of which there are many around the shores of Milford Sound. It's a very common, iconic New Zealand plant. And then painting some of these grasses and reeds. There are lots of different colours there. Some of them are a straw yellow or a rusty red. And I'm applying the paint here with a bristle dagger brush and just painting it in vertical brush marks in the way that the direction of these grasses and reeds are growing. I've worked off my original green mix, but I've added a lot more yellow ochre into the mix and titanium white just to lighten the valley, but also to create those straw tones in there. And then I was able to add colours such as alizarin crimson just to add a red element into it and just give it that rusty yellow-green look. Now whenever I paint landscapes, I'm always thinking in terms of values, the lights and darks, more so than the actual colours that I'm using, although the colour mixing is important. So for example, in the right side of this painting, especially in the foreground, it's more in shadow, so I'm using some darker tones here, and then just keeping an eye on that spotlighted area in the left midground side of the painting. Now I hope you're enjoying this video so far and you're finding it helpful. If you'd like to see the full version of this video where I show you how to paint this artwork from start to finish and show you how to mix all the colours which I demonstrate on my palette, then I'm actually giving this video away for free. All you need to do is just click the link below and I'll send it over to you, and as I say, it's completely free. Enjoy! Now then, back to the painting, and I'm starting to think about getting it finished. So one of the things I'm doing now, which I normally do when I'm thinking about wrapping up the painting, is restating the dark values. So what this does is it helps to define shapes, things like adding shadows in the plants here. So certainly with plants and vegetation, you often get a lot of occlusion shadows, which is why things like trees and plants in general are some of the darkest values in the landscape, especially trees. And you can see it here with these trees that I'm painting in the midground. So as I say, I'm just restating the dark values here. For this, I'm using a combination of ultramarine blue with a little bit of yellow ochre. Also some titanium white if I need to lighten the values slightly. Now what I'm doing here after restating a lot of these dark values was I was just starting to paint the suggestion of these rocks and pebbles that are in the water. I'm keeping in mind the value because I've got to make sure that it's not too light, because otherwise it will look a bit strange in the painting, but I'm just using some low chroma colours to paint those rocks. And then the next thing to do was just paint the little bit of subtle highlight that was on the top of Mitre Peak here, just exposing some of the rocky faces in the sun. For this I just use a low chroma mix of burnt sienna with a little yellow ochre, some titanium white. There's also a tiny bit of alizarin crimson and some ultramarine blue in there to desaturate. So really this is the only kind of part of the mountain, with the exception of the snow as well, that's illuminated in the sun. And then I'm also adding more highlight to some of these clouds here, just to create a nice lighting effect in the painting. After I'd finished working on the clouds, the next thing to do was to paint some more of the snow that's at the tops of these mountains. And as a lot of the snow is under the cloud shadow, I was using a slightly darker mix of ultramarine blue with titanium white and just a dash of alizarin crimson and a small amount of burnt sienna to desaturate. So very similar colours to what I've used in the clouds and also the mountain shadows. So I've got to make sure that it's not too light, otherwise it's going to come forward in the painting. It just needs to sit back in the landscape. Now there was a tiny bit of snow on the top of Mitre Peak that was in the full sunlight, and for this I used a mix of titanium white with just a little bit of yellow ochre, so that's just going to warm up the white. And as I'm coming to the end of the painting, this is where I've saved my lightest values, saving them till last, and it was just painting a few highlights and sparkles in the water here that just gives it a nice ethereal look and just some extra depth in the painting. It really helps to make the painting pop. Now I was applying the paint here with a No. 0 synthetic pointed round brush and just painting little dots of paint to communicate those sparkles. There's also things like tidying up the edges of the water, as there's some reflections there and some sparkles from the sun, and then just adding some last little details on some of these rocks and pebbles. Again, I'm using the same type of brush, a No. 0 synthetic pointed round, so this helps to get some really fine detail. I can also use this brush for painting things like the main stem of this tree that's in the midground. I finished up this painting by just adding some last little bits of detail to the vegetation and also the water in the foreground. So even for the vegetation, this is where I've saved some of my lightest greens, primarily a mix of cadmium yellow with ultramarine blue, titanium white, a little phthalo green and a little bit of alizarin crimson. There's even a few little highlights to be added to some of these flax plants in the foreground. And with that, the painting was complete. Also, one of the last things I did to this painting was to peel off the masking tape so I could truly see what the painting looks like. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and don't forget you can watch the full version of this painting tutorial for free by clicking the link below. Happy painting, and I'll see you in the next video.